in Christ. And I'm going to quote from places where the covenant is the subject under discussion. First of all, Calvin calls union with Christ, the union with Christ that is the essence of salvation, wedlock. I quote, Institutes 3:1-3. The union of the child of God with Christ is that sacred wedlock through which we are made flesh of his flesh and bone of his bones. End of quote. Now, wedlock alludes to God's marriage to the church, as described, for example, in Ezekiel 16 and in Ephesians 5. And this marriage relationship in the Bible is the covenant, as Calvin well knew. Second, there are numerous explicit statements in Calvin that the covenant is essentially the relationship of fellowship in love between Christ and his elect church. Two such statements occur in Calvin's commentary on that great covenant passage in the Old Testament, Jeremiah 31. Calvin observes that the word covenant that God used in the promise of a new covenant was more, quote, honorable, end quote, to Israel than the word edict would have been. For covenant means that God, and now I quote, descends and appears in the midst of them, that he may bind himself to his people as he binds the people to himself. What is that? That's a bond. That's a relationship of communion. Regarding the words, I will be to them a God and they will be to me a people, the covenant formula, and Calvin calls it that, expressing what the covenant is, Calvin says, quote, here God comprehends generally the substance of his covenant. End of quote. Until recently, most Reformed and Presbyterian theologians have not followed this lead of Calvin, preferring rather to view the covenant as a contract or an agreement or even as a bargain between God and men, as though the covenant were similar to a business deal. Of late, Reformed theologians have evidently changed their conception of the covenant, for we increasingly read and hear of the covenant as a bond. This is welcome, but may we be pardoned for asking for the reason for this change in the conception of the covenant. At issue in the two main views of the covenant that I described at the beginning of this speech, the view of the covenant on the one hand as a conditional contract with all the children alike, or on the other hand as a bond of communion unconditionally established by God with the elect only. At issue in the controversy between these two views of the covenant is whether the covenant is governed by election. The issue is this. In the Reformed and Presbyterian churches from the 16th century Reformation to the present time, there have been two different doctrines of the covenant. The one views the covenant as a saving relationship that God graciously establishes with his elect. The other views the covenant as a conditional pact or agreement between God and every baptized person. God may have established this conditional pact in grace with every baptized child originally at baptism, but the continuation of the covenant with the children and the realization of the covenant in the final salvation of the children depend upon a child's performing certain conditions. That's the other contesting view of the covenant. Now, I do not have time tonight to demonstrate this historical fact, namely, that there have been these two distinct doctrines of the covenant within the Reformed tradition vying for supremacy. These two doctrines of the covenant were very much involved in the controversy of the Orthodox Reformed with the Arminians in the early 17th century at the time of the Synod of Dort. And that is the reason why, although there is not a chapter devoted to the covenant in the canons of Dort, there are significant references to the covenant and decisive statements about the covenant in Canons 2:8 and in Canons 2, Rejection of Errors, 2, 3, and 4. These two doctrines of the covenant were on the foreground in the history of the secession churches in the Netherlands in the 19th century. And these two doctrines of the covenant were the issue in the controversies and schisms that I mentioned earlier in this speech, in the Netherlands in the early 1940s and in North America in the Protestant Reformed churches in the early 1950s. The Dutch theologian C. Grafland has demonstrated the fact of these two different conceptions of the covenant in the Reformed churches from the time of the Reformation on in his magisterial 3-volume work, Van Calvijn tot Comrie, an English translation, although the books are not translated from Calvin to Comrie. The fundamental issue between these two doctrines of the covenant is whether the covenant of grace is closely related to, indeed governed by, God's eternal unconditional decree of election. That is God's purpose with the covenant the realization of his decree of election in the saving of the elect and of the elect only? Does election determine who will be and who will not be saved in the covenant? And does election determine to whom God makes the gracious promise of the covenant, with whom he establishes graciously the covenant, and with whom he graciously keeps the covenant unto the everlasting salvation of that person and those persons?